Cool. So, so thank you all for coming. It's great to have everyone here. This is kind of an different experience for me because I'm doing both the I keep clicking. Sorry about that. I keep okay. So I'm doing both the organizing and the presenting today. I think that will go smoothly. Last time when Meg presented, we did this innovation where I asked you guys to just use the chat for feedback, references, but then once the presentation is done, we will do a new queue. Okay, here's somebody's background noise. Okay. All right, now did I mute myself? No, okay, you can hear me, right? Everyone can hear me still? Okay, awesome. All right, so yeah, without further delay, thank you again for coming on the call, and let me take you through my my presentation. I've shortened the title from the last version because there will be just a little bit about the superfluous innovation. It's mostly about the forgone innovation, and that's, I guess, what happens when one works on those sorts of things. It's they evolve, right? So I have one slide that takes you through the whole presentation, and then we go into the details. So here, I know this doesn't work. Okay. All right. So let's see. I'm just gonna change my setup a little bit here. Okay, so here we go. So basically, I start with this idea that humans are inherently creative. We have propensity to solve problems, and that propensity to solve problems is invisible in mainstream conceptualizations. And the reason it's invisible is because in the mainstream, everything is about choice, right? So, oh, sharing is paused. Okay, sorry, are you guys able to see my screen as well as, yeah, okay. For some reason it says that I have paused. Sharing is paused.
Oh, did you change slides?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I just see the title.
Oh, okay. How do I fix this? Okay, you are screen sharing. So, okay, so this is my, all right, thanks for that. So now you can see the slide with like big red squares, right? All right. Okay. All right. Yes, you can see that. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Okay. So propensity to okay. So from the top. So we start with this idea that humans are inherently creative, that they engage in problem solving, and this idea, even though it sounds kind of obvious, is actually not part of the mainstream economics, right? In mainstream economics, human action is understood as choice within constraints, right? So it's not inherently creative. So I started with like this slightly different conceptual, not slightly, pretty different conceptualization of human action. And then because it is absent in mainstream economics, you have to necessitate use of exogenous solutions, right? So because the framework is closed, you have to use regulation to move. If you see inefficiency, you have to use regulation to improve. Well, what's different about regulation is that it suppresses discovery of alternative solutions. So as I will argue today, innovation and regulation are both expressions of human creativity. They have similar origins, but while innovation, when it happens, other forms of problem solving can continue, regulation will suppress close alternatives, right? So when we regulate, basically that regulatory solution is the one and other ones cannot be discovered, right? So there is like this monopoly of solutions, so to speak. And when you do that, you basically suppress innovation, and that actually legitimizes more calls for regulation. So this is a super quick summary of what I want to talk about today. Okay, now to move on, I want to take you a little bit through how mainstream economists think about regulation. So there are many approaches, of course, But if we go a little bit back in time and sort of think as like the common origins of how we think about regulation, it's going to be some sort of a supply-demand model and the reference to deadweight loss, right? And deadweight losses can result from quotas, taxation, monopoly power, all sorts of reasons. And the interesting thing with this literature is that when they started to measure the deadweight loss, the Huepenbecker triangle, in the 50s and 60s, they found that the quantity, like the actual impact was quite small, that the Huepenbecker triangle, the waste in the context of monopoly was insignificant. So that was quite interesting, right? And in response to those findings, to sort of say the conclusion that maybe monopoly is not a problem, this whole public choice literature emerged, right? And in particular, Tolog with his monopoly rents. And the Tolog insight, which I like to stress, is that it's not so much about the shape here, right, of what's being competed for. For him, it was more about this movement between the two equilibria, right, between the free market equilibrium and the regulatory equilibrium. And what Tolog contributed was this dynamic shift, right, that the change doesn't happen sort of by magic. It happens because there's competition for rents. And the reason I talk about Tolog and the rent-seeking literature is because from Tolog we then get a number of different contributions that look at all sorts of different consequences of regulation, right? So we get literature on impact on the other industries. So that's actually Tolog in a later paper talks about, well, if a plumber becomes a thief, he's no longer a plumber, so wages for plumbers go up. Or if a lawyer starts to work for a lobbying group, he's no longer working in some other sector, so wages for lawyers go up, right? So resources are wasted and the prices of those resources go up in other industries. So that's one outcome of this literature. Another one is the literature on competition for information. So if you know whether Boeing or Lockheed Martin are getting a new contract, that information is quite valuable. Yes, you can use it to your advantage in a stock market. So there will be competition to find out, right? There will be efforts to find out ahead of time. And then another one, and again, I'm not going to be exhaustive. I just want to show you that there's a lot of richness coming out of these frameworks. Another one is competition for what has already been put in place to preserve, right? So rent-seeking effort might lead to some licensing laws, restrictions on entry. Then there will be efforts to preserve those laws and ensure that they are being enforced. And that's actually kind of interesting, and maybe what makes me pessimistic about going back to normal after COVID is because, well, there are winners from COVID, right? There are government agencies that won, and they are not going to let those winnings disappear very easily. So I don't know, I look forward to not wearing masks and being back to normal, but the rent-seeking literature suggests that the normal is not going to happen. But maybe I'm wrong, we'll see. So anyway, okay, so we have the public interest literature, then we have public choice response to that literature, and the public choice is using the same tools as the neoclassical economists, but basically gives up this benevolence, right? Policymakers are the same as everyone else, they're self-interested, so we get sort of, so whatever regulatory equilibrium you might get, it's not necessarily an improvement on the market. And I mean, there's a lot of insight and a lot that we learned from that literature, no question about it. But Kirchner, to all of it, will say not good enough, right? So why? Because for one, when you think of this movement from Q1 to Q2 as change in transactions, right? Like just a number of transactions, you just think of exchange as allocation mechanism. You're not thinking of exchange as a learning or discovery mechanism, right? So that's one thing that is missing in this public choice literature is the discovery and the learning that occurs in transactions. So exchange is more than just allocation mechanism. Okay, so what Kirchner said in this 78 essay, The Perils of Regulation, is that all that literature is actually likely missing the most important consequence of regulation, which is discouragement, hampering, and even complete stifling of the discovery processes, right? So this is a quote. And he believes, Kirchner believes, that this is the most serious effect of government regulation. And then he basically says to the interventionism or to the critics of interventionism that not good enough, right? Like you've done well, but you haven't done well enough. And I'm paraphrasing. So Kirchner is much nicer. He doesn't actually say not good enough, but he says you haven't exhausted all the possibilities. Okay. So what you're still missing, right? So Kirchner to the public choice. You're missing the undiscovered discovery process and unsimulated discovery process. And I had to have it on the slide because it's so hard to remember, right? But they're different. So the first one, the first channel is regulators cannot tell inefficiency versus market knowledge. So just as a regulator, you cannot really recognize inefficiencies, right? So I mean that's not that's intuitive to us, but not necessarily a dominant thinking in the mainstream. And second one is that as regulators, you like the profit loss mechanism, so you will make mistakes. So that's part of the argument for what's wrong with the interventionist literature in Kirchner's eyes. But he also says that you're going to miss stifled discovery process. So basically, innovation being made illegal or infeasible. And an excellent example of this sort of thinking is actually this thinking of bailouts as an alternative to bankruptcy that Delisanti and Wagner published in 2018. If you haven't read that paper, I encourage you to read it. It's a good paper. It's very sort of straightforward and simple illumination of this idea that when regulatory processes unfold, we shouldn't compare to some emptiness, right? We compare to alternative market processes that would unfold in their place. And then another one that Kirchner points out is this wholly superfluous discovery process, which means that there will be innovation in response to regulation, but that's wasteful, right? That's superfluous. Okay, and one that comes out of my world of like healthcare is medical reimbursement consulting. So there are firms that speak to physicians and medical device companies, right? So let's say you invest in a medical devices business. The success of your business is going to depend on whether you qualify for a medical reimbursement. Even if you are not making something for seniors, medical reimbursement drives private reimbursement. So it's crucial. So you have consulting groups that help companies obtain positive reimbursement decisions, right? So that's superfluous, right? That's a result of regulation. Now, superfluous innovation is easy to spot, right? Like that's the kind of innovation that's easy to see in our reality. Here we have the igloos, right? The tents that are a response to the restrictions on indoor dining, right? So with COVID, many places forbid indoor dining. So now we have indoor dining outside thanks to these tents. I mean, I don't know what kind of, I'm not a scientist, but I suspect they're not very effective, right? Like, yeah. Anyway, okay. So I actually am not going to spend much more time on the superfluous innovation. We will go back to talking about this forgone, stifled innovation. But the interesting thing is that superfluous innovation is everywhere, and I'm sure you could come up with your own examples very, very easily. So where do we go from here? Well, we will introduce some stuff from Koppel. Koppel et al. This is a team of researchers. So Roger Koppel, who we are lucky to have on the call here, but also Stuart Kaufman and a number of other co-authors. And I will be citing a couple of their papers here. But basically, I think this was the first of the publications in this stream, and they make sort of a bold claim, right? They say give up mainstream modeling practices, right? Like everything, and it's bold, but I think it's very helpful that they're being so bold because, well, you'll see. But okay, so give up the mainstream modeling practices, and why? Well, because space of economic evolution is not stable. So basically, what they argue is that there's continuous generation of novelty in economic systems, and that's why you cannot work with closed-ended models, right? You cannot have laws of motion describing the economy, because the economy is inherently dynamic system, right? So economic dynamics are creative, and there's this notion of new adjacent possible. So I will explain this with their example. They use the example of a screwdriver, right? Are you guys familiar with this? I'm sure, like, yeah, I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of this, but basically what they say, and this goes back to earlier work by Kaufman, is that there are infinite uses for a screwdriver, right? So, but these uses will depend on what else is happening in the economy. So you can use a screwdriver as an antenna for a radio, but you can only just do it in the 20th century, right? Like you couldn't do it in the 17th or like or even 19th century, right? Because you need to have home radios in order to use the screwdriver for your antenna. So basically, there's this continuous generation of novelty that comes from new products coming on the market, and the new products in the market generate new uses for the existing products. And they talk about this new adjacent possible. So every time there's a new product on the market, it opens up possibilities for new uses. And now it's up to the other entrepreneurs or other tinkerers to discover those uses. Okay, so the economic evolution is not stable. Economic dynamics are creative, right? And so that basically if we believe them, right? If we accept this argument, then the mainstream modeling practices are in fact not very useful or accurate. Okay, so then they bring up this notion of tinkering, and that's how they describe human behavior, right? So humans not only choose, but they also tinker, and that's where this mechanism of generation of novelty comes in, right? So here I have a different author, it's Casola Gatti, but it's the same, it's a new co-author on the same team. So this is also Roger's work. And I'm gonna read you this quote. When considering technological change, we should model humans as tinkerers, cobbling together existing elements as well as they can, adjusting, tweaking, and combining in an unending process of trial and error, right? So tinkering, trial and error, and important here is this word cobbling together existing elements, right? So, so this isn't some sort of inspired creative process. It's more of a small change, trial and error kind of effort, and that's going to be relevant for our further thinking. Okay. All right. So why do humans tinker? That's relevant, right? Like if we want to believe that humans tinker, we should know why. The answer you get in from Koppel et al. Is that it's evolutionary, right? That there are some biological reasons for tinkering. But if you think about this more in like Austrian sense or like Mises sense, well, why humans do whatever, it's because it improves our well-being, right? Like it replaces states we value less with the states we value more. And that might sound tautological, but it's quite insightful, right? Like so I would this being evolutionary is not exclusive to this being a process of replacing states we value less with states we value more, and that allows us to think of tinkering as purposeful. And this is again maybe one of those obvious things, but not necessarily, because you have some concepts, so some evolutionary literature within economics that actually thinks of human action or human decisions as random, and then the process is driven by the environment, right? So I'm referring to Alschen. Here, my interpretation of Koppel et al. Is that they think of tinkering as purposeful and problem-oriented, right? So if I think of tinkering as a drive to replace states I value less with states I value more, well, I can do that by finding more effective ways of gathering more fish and bananas, but I can also do that by serving others, right? By improving well-being of others. So tinkering is purposeful in the sense that it's done to improve my well-being, but I do that by being problem-oriented, right? Like, how do I serve other people? Well, you need to spot some problems and solve them for others. omnipresent, and that's something that here's where we tie this to entangled political economy. So this process is not just occurring in the market, right? So regulation is to a form of innovation, and I know that might be a stretch, and I haven't really explored this in the paper, but I think a lot of things that we say about tinkering and how tinkering pertains to innovation can be said about regulation too, right? It's regulation will, like if you think of the superfluous innovation, well, those igloos in the restaurants are an exploration of the adjacent possible that was made, that was created through regulation, right? So regulation too will lead to sort of explorations of new adjacent possibles. Okay. So, and it's easier to think of that when we bring up entangled political economy, and that the interactions between private and market enterprises and them being part of the same network. And then tinkering generates innovation. And this is something that I had to spend some time thinking about. It's in their papers, in my understanding, but I think it's they actually make a very neat distinction between tinkering and innovation, right? So I want to stress this for us. So innovation is emergent. Innovation emerges from tinkering, and innovation is not something we do, it's something that happens to us. So we have this individual trial and error, tinkering, individual effort, and then it's through exchange, through the market, through regulatory efforts as well, that it becomes innovation. Okay. So just to sort of highlight how this difference from between closed-ended models and open-ended models. So closed-ended is pretty much everything that has anything to do with equilibrium or neoclassical mainstream economics, right? Those are closed-ended models. Human action is reduced to choice, versus in open-ended models, so the models of the evolutionary economics or complexity economics, you will have choice, but you also have tinkering, and you also, I don't go into this in the paper, but there are other authors that also think of expanding this human action to being more than choice, right? So you have notions of effectuation in Sarasvati's work. Sarasvati is quite focused on going beyond optimization and describing human action as much richer. Experimentation in Harper, I think that there's actually quite a connection between tinkering and experimentation. So Harper uses Polanyi's hypothesis testing, right? So entrepreneurs test hypotheses, right? They're kind of like scientists, but it's not. It might seem different from tinkering. I don't think it is as different as the authors. I don't know, something worth exploring. And then judgment from force and claim. And the notion of judgment and tinkering, what they have in common is that the entrepreneur or the tinkerer faces tremendous uncertainty, right? So you don't really know what you're doing, right? You're not creating innovation. You're acting on like whatever it's available to you. You're tinkering within the resources you have, but what's going to come out of that is unknowable to you, right? In any case, the reason I even have this slide here is to highlight that in these open-ended models, human action is a source of novelty, right? So you have different ways of thinking of what humans do, but there seems to be a trend of trying to do more trying to think of human behavior as more than optimization. Okay, so the trick here, and I think the reason this isn't something that's well understood in the mainstream, is that it's really impossible to know what's forgone, right? Forgone innovation is inherently unknowable. So I'm going to throw some Kirchner at you again. The problem is that one cannot imagine what specific, now unknown opportunities might have been discovered in the relevant hypothetical circumstances. So those circumstances, these are the circumstances of regulation, right? So if you, if we have regulation, we cannot know what would be forgone if there was no regulation, right? And if you, okay, so forgone innovation is inherently unknowable. And actually, before I throw this example at you, it's also very scary to talk about forgone innovation. So like, as an example or an experiment, what I would suggest you might do is talk to someone, not necessarily even an economist, right? Like in your departments, I'm sure you have some straight economists, right, like mainstream economists, talk to them about some place where safety is a concern and suggest some very innovative solution, right? So I did that with childcare, right? Like suggest to someone that maybe robots can lower like use of robots or use of artificial intelligence combined with optical recognition might improve childcare settings, right? Instead of hiring specific ratios of childcare, caretakers, let's use robots and artificial intelligence. Most people freak out when they hear that, right? And they kind of have good reasons, because children need to see faces for the brain to properly develop. But there are sensors, right? You could use sensors for monitoring. So there are sensors that measure oxygenation, and you can have sensors measuring heartbeat, and those could replace humans, right? And lower childcare costs, but they're illegal right now. So anyway, thinking of like what could be is very, very difficult. And okay, but why am I talking about this? Because this is the challenge here, right? Like, how do we trust the creative powers of humans, right? The creativity of the creative economy when we don't know what is at stake, right? Like, how can we square these two things? Well, I think the easiest exercise, like thought exercise for this purpose, is to think of something that actually happened, some sort of major innovation, and try to imagine the world without it. Okay, so think of a major innovation and try to imagine how the world would look if that innovation didn't take place. Okay, so my example, imagine that in 1970, a regulation was enacted that forbid, name of national security, sales of computers to households and businesses, right? So, you know, some well-intentioned policymaker in 1970 comes up with this regulation, very worried about all these computer chips getting into the hands of citizens or foreigners, communists back then, right? We don't want any communist hands on our computer chips and our innovation. So let's just make sure that those are only sold to government or maybe non-profits, right? So huge restriction on this emerging revolution. Okay, so what would happen? Well, we don't know, but let's go back again to like the couple framework. This is straight from their papers. This is not, I didn't make this, I basically copy pasted this from the paper by Casola Gatti and others, but it's a cool way of thinking about these adjacent possibles, right? So in this first image here on the left, you see all these dots, and these dots, they talk about biology and species, but for our purposes, think about products, right? And I mean, they use biology to talk about products too. So in the first one, you have a bunch of products, and these products are the reason why in the next one, you can have more products, and then you can have more products, right? Because each new product creates new uses for itself, and those new uses are then explored, right? And they call this can be diversity. So diversity in things traded, and it expands. So basically, new novelty generates novelty. Okay. All right. So if you think about my question, back to my question about the computer revolution, like we kill computer revolution by saying no sales, you cannot sell computers to individuals. What happens? Well, a lot of things wouldn't happen. Okay. Just my list is super random, and like, well, just take a look. I'm sure you can come up with a longer list. But yeah, some things that wouldn't happen. Okay. All right. So I'm sure you could make like a decision tree, right? So like if no internet, then no email, then no video conferencing and so on, right? This could be presented in a more sophisticated way. But what I'm trying to get at here, two things. One is that we would be in a very different world. We wouldn't have this conversation, right? So it wouldn't be just that we don't have computers. There would be all these other products, right? That richness that happened over time that we wouldn't be experiencing right now, right? Maybe it will be a better world. I don't think so. I think you could find people who would think that the world without all this innovation would be better. I don't think so, but it doesn't matter, right? Like the normative evaluations of that. It's just the fact is that if we restricted the sales of computers back a couple of decades ago, this would not happen or would be significantly slowed down. Okay. All right, so here's the image. This is like the office in the 1960s, right? Like this is where we are now, back to that world. No computer revolution, no internet revolution, no no sharing economy. Okay. Okay, Nathaniel, you have your. Nathaniel, do you want to? Sorry, do you want to jump in? I just noticed you had your hand up. Sorry, and I. What? Yeah. Do you want to say? Sorry.
No, keep going. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we'll do. If I'm happy to explain something quickly, or if I'm not being clear, but we can do questions after. Okay. So, okay. So we have this office here, and this is kind of how I imagine the world without computers would look. We have this office of the like late 1960s, and of course, there's something fishy about my example, right? Like it's hard to believe that this rich world would not evolve without with just one regulation. Right? We could kill all this richness, all this innovation with just one regulation. Okay, so am I being overly dramatic, right? Like, could it be so easy to kill innovation? Maybe. I give you that, right? And I'm probably need to spend more time thinking about this example, but just think through the mechanism, right? So I'm saying this is the world we would have if we killed the computer revolution or something similar to this, right? Like the world would continue to unfold, but we will be kind of stuck in the late 1960s. Okay. But maybe I'm being overly dramatic, because obviously the people of the late 1960s, they would resist such harmful regulation. Don't you think so, right? Like they are at the edge of this huge revolution, and then someone comes in and regulates their way out of it. Like, is that maybe that would prevent the harmful regulation? But here's the thing, and this is like I don't know, like I didn't start writing this paper with this in mind, but this is to me the most important thing from all of this. They didn't know what they could lose, right? Like this lady in that office there, she had no idea what's about to happen. She didn't know about Zoom. She didn't know about like smart cars or I don't know, whatever I had on the previous slide, Wikipedia, right? Like she had no idea. She doesn't have to pay $50 a month to have encyclopedias delivered to her that were far inferior to what Wikipedia is, right? So, so this whole idea, well, maybe they would resist harmful regulation. I don't buy it, because they don't know what they are about to lose, right? You with me? Okay. So why? And back to couple. Contributions to individual thinkers are tiny, right? Very, very small. So individual thinkers themselves don't know what they're generating. Innovations are not designed or even created, they emerge. So in order to trust that nobody knew back then what's about to happen, right, and what's about to forgone, we need to acknowledge that tinkering is not the same as innovation, that tinkering is this tiny little changes, and then innovation emerges out of that. And the example the authors, couple and others use is the Wright brothers, right, how they tinkered their way to heavier than air flight. And sure, they wanted to create flying, right? They wanted to fly, they knew that, but how did they accomplish it? By trial and error. And more importantly, they had no idea that we would be flying around, right? Like I just got back from Savannah, and like that's not something that they envisioned, right? Or had in mind when they tinkered their way to flight. Some other examples of like how little we understand what's about to happen. I got this from Trevor Burrus on the podcast, Free Thoughts, a good podcast if you have time. Taxis in old sci-fi movies. So Trevor talks about how when you watch like old sci-fi movies and how they envision the future, there is always a taxi, right? So like even though they're like if they didn't envision an Uber, and you know that you can just get the cab on your phone, right? Like there is the traditional hailing of taxis. And then Steve Jobs, when he thought of iPhone, that was just supposed to be an iPad that made calls, right? It wasn't that thing that will replace everything and that will put us to sleep and wake us in the morning and help us keep track of what we eat and so on, right? Like it was that's not what he envisioned. In fact, Steve Jobs resisted the App Store, right? He didn't want to open the App Store. So, so we always make, like as individuals, we make mistakes all the time, and we have no idea what the process of innovation can actually generate. And yet, at the same time, we are creative, right? So, so I don't know. I hope I'm clear on that. And I don't know if it's as profound as I think it is, but I think it's super profound that we do not know what we lose when we regulate. Okay. So now, like the empirical part of the paper, I want to focus on healthcare. One thing, and maybe this is my bias, I feel like I see this Forgone innovation everywhere. So to sort of focus the paper, I focus on healthcare, and just to give you some examples. So we have a tax exemption on employer-sponsored health insurance. This is why you buy your health insurance from your university. And why it might be scary to quit, right? Sometimes and become an entrepreneur, because there is the tax exemption, so it's cheaper. Basically, your health insurance is bought with your pre-tax dollars. So that means all the other ways of doing of paying for healthcare are going to be relatively more expensive, right? Because you cannot use the tax deduction. So that's just one, right? So that kills different models of paying for healthcare. Medicare itself enforces fragmentation. So if you, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Medicare, but there are, Medicare pays separately to hospitals and to physicians, right? So now you have hospitals and physicians as independent organizations, right, pursuing different goals. And instead of buying healthcare, you as a buyer, you're buying physician services and hospital services. So there is a lot of foregone innovation that could happen if you had that combined. And an excellent example you might have heard of is Oklahoma Surgery Center. So it's a private hospital in Oklahoma, and you can get a surgery at a fraction of the price. Of course, Americans who have insurance don't go there, because insurance, it doesn't make it cheaper for, it's not cheaper than if your insurance paid for it, but it's cheaper for Canadians who don't need to wait, right? So they come to Oklahoma to get this at the private hospital. And they don't take Medicare or any insurance payments. State insurance mandate. So every state mandates what needs to be covered by health insurance. Well, that prevents growth of catastrophic health insurance, which would only cover catastrophic events, and then you would pay for your regular healthcare with other means. And it reduces competition, because if everyone has to cover the same things, there is less competition, right? You don't start an insurance company just covering the basics, because you can't. Physician-driven reimbursement decisions. This is a big one. It's sort of invisible. So physicians are on these boards that decide what gets to be reimbursed by the Medicare, and Medicare reimbursement drives private reimbursement. So physicians tend to not approve of things that replace physicians, right? So they will approve and drive innovation in areas that increase their productivity and their payment. So MRIs, all sorts of imaging, scanning technologies, medical devices, things that are heavy, that basically result in high payments. I have a paper somewhere else on contraceptives and why there's such a pressure for IUDs versus, because those come with higher payments. So a lot of regulation basically drives the types of things we use and see in healthcare here. And then the restrictions on telemedicine reimbursement. I have a little bit, well, I should be probably finishing up now, but this is a funny one. So before COVID, if you wanted to see a doctor on screen, right, like this, you could only do this at the physician's office. So you couldn't get a reimbursement from Medicare to call a physician from your home. You had to be at the hospital or some other federally approved medical outlet, so to speak, and it had to be, and the doctor couldn't be available there. So basically, like in a rural Minnesota, you would go to a hospital, but they don't have some specialist there. That only for that conversation with a specialist, Medicare would pay. Otherwise, they wouldn't pay for using the medical, the telemedicine, which is ridiculous, right? And COVID changed this, and we'll see what happens next. But it's a ridiculous regulation, especially if you think that you can call Santa Claus at Christmas, you can have a Santa call conversation for your kid for like $20, right? So Santa is available, but not the doctor, right? So anyway, regulation destroys innovation. Okay. And I have some examples of how mainstream thinkers think about this stuff. So just let me talk you through the first two. So Finkelstein and McKnight, they have this elaborate, sort of sophisticated econometric paper on Medicare impact on longevity, and they find none. So Medicare did not expand, didn't contribute to life expectation of the seniors. Okay, so they're probably bumped out by that. But what they say instead is, well, at least there were welfare gains from reduced risk exposure. So maybe the seniors don't live longer, but they live better lives because they are not exposed to risk thanks to Medicare. Well, that might be true, but what are they forgetting? That the market would provide some other forms of insurance, right, for seniors. And they existed before Medicare, and they existed in other non-Medicare sectors of the market. So that's the missed thing here, right? Like that only Medicare can reduce this risk exposure. And of course, that's not true. And then another paper that's very recent is Medicare-induced patenting. So sure, there's more patenting with Medicare. It's very specific kind of patenting. So it's medical devices primarily, those kinds of things that enhance productivity of physicians. But what happens? Other things are not solved. And there's a very good paper from the 70s, old paper about half technologies and big technologies. And you can link this to Medicare and show that Medicare drives half technologies and doesn't drive this huge technologies that basically eradicate disease. All right, so I think conclusions, honestly, I think that I'm still thinking about conclusions. I hope you will help me think about them, but tinkering is omnipresent. We get innovation, but we also get regulatory changes because of that. But the thing about the novel market solutions that they do not suppress discovery of alternatives. And we must accept our inability to imagine what's forgone, yet we need to trust that creativity and tinkering is omnipresent. All right, I'm gonna stop here. I'm pretty sure I went over time of what I wanted, but let's see, I will stop sharing and we will open it to the queue. So stop share. Okay, all righty, I see. Okay, so if you have questions, just let's do the hand thingy like we did last week. So I had Nathaniel and Abby. Daniel, Abby. Okay, and then. Alrighty, so Nathaniel. Oh, and John.
All right, so you've done the tinkering. Now we will innovate. Right. I've got a question. Do animals tinker? We might think about ants as exploring, like going out to try to find food, and that might be tinkering. And then they bring that information back to the nest. And but ants don't have property. And when they get that information, I think they share it. I'm not sure if they trade it. So that's my first question. And my bigger question might be that that whatever changes happen in the innovative process and the tinkering process, we can't know how can we decide whether there's a normative value to it in either direction, and if there's not a normative concern in either direction, then why should anybody care? So we can't just say that it would be better if it had been open. We all kind of think that it is, but unlocking that and figuring out why it would be better to allow the innovation rather than to foreclose upon it is something really, really deep that I think that we have to think through. So the other thing that I would mention is the Kerzner move here, to presume that that the intentions are that it's well intentioned. So that's sort of the same move that Mises and Hayek make quite often in making their arguments. Andrew Ferrant really has a problem with that. And there was a paper back in 2010 that I think he gave at the Summer Institute, and then Pete Bedke talked about it, and I see that it's on coordination problem back then, and Roger commented on in that conversation, as did Barclay Roser as well. So that might be something to look into, just in terms of this bigger question about, are there dangers in presuming the benevolence of the person making the regulation, that go beyond just trying to, you know, be kind and generous in the argument, that maybe there's a problem with being generous in the argument. So that's all I got.
Okay, awesome. All right. So as a presenter, I will now respond, I guess. So I'm still kind of confused on the order, but awesome. I don't know if I know the answers to all of this. I guess the dangers of presuming the intentions, I don't necessarily think it's crucial for my argument or for my thinking to assume that they are benevolent. I think it's just like doing one thing at a time, right? So yes, Mises and Kirchner, they want to be sort of kind and show that knowledge problems persist even if you assume the best of intentions. Maybe this gets back to your normative value of innovation, right? So if the alternatives are between non-benevolent regulators and allowing for this process that we don't know what it might bring, well, then the process is a little bit, I don't know if it becomes a better alternative, but it might be not as scary, right? If the alternative are non-benevolent regulators. So yeah, as for the ants and trade, I see where you're going with that analogy. I don't know if I have no idea about ants, but I'm sure that there are other differences, right? Like you started talking about exchange, right? So yes, maybe they tinker, maybe they try to be more effective at what they do, but it would be hard to talk about exchange among animals. So yeah, I don't know. And I will, yeah. So I guess that's all I have to say to that question. All right, and then I have Abby.
Hi, Marta. Thanks for the great talk. I missed your talk on this weekend, so I'm glad to be here now. So I wanted to push back just a little bit on one part of this in particular, and this part is I don't know if it's an assumption or just sort of a running theme that market discovery is being treated here as fundamentally different than regulatory discovery. I don't think that's in dispute. I mean, you explicitly do that. You make that, you differentiate between the two things. But we have to be very careful that market discovery isn't, seen as some kind of, panacea. There are limited resources available to people engaging in market discovery. Knowledge is always constrained, as is computation. The time that you take tinkering, and finding one solution that then helps you realize some plan that's underway, and then spreads throughout the system as the thing that people use to help realize their plans that are underway. That time that you spend innovating that particular sort of Lego block to your plan is time that you don't spend and can't spend. You never get it back. Innovating, and if you think of it in the system, in terms of system, there's a constrained human system as well. So that time block is a part of that, increment that can never be gotten back. And so you may have some kind of Lego block that is a part of a plan people use to realize some goal. That is the alternative, and an alternative exists, is possible, is out there, that is more efficient, better somehow overall, but is never found. So there is a constraint on time and constraint on knowledge. People rely on advice from others in particular, even in a market process, perhaps especially in a market process. We rely on advice from experts, from industry leaders, from our parents, from our teachers. And we don't make every single decision as in a dyadic form. There is going to be some sort of triadic relationship, some insertion of somebody else who's helping us make sense of things, allowing us to save time and computation, which are resources that we have very limited supply of, in order to make some choice. So I wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that the market discovery process allows you to investigate all alternatives. It can't, and perhaps one can argue that it can help you discover more, right? But what about that? Maybe there's one missing alternative that would have been way better. And because of the configuration, the institutional configuration, because I don't know, people use iPhones, and Bill Gates, oh my gosh, and Steve Jobs told them that this certain thing is happening to the planet, and then you should therefore make a decision based on his advice because you use an iPhone and you trust Steve Jobs because you like your iPhone. That's a very path dependent kind of way of getting your knowledge. And making decisions, but this is what we do, and I'm not saying it's kind of corporatism all the way down in the market structure. I'm just saying you're going to have a lot more triadic than dyadic relationships. So just pushing back on a little bit of that, and I have some. There's one other thing. I'm sorry, people. There's one other thing. There are more than two kinds of innovations, right? You have superfluous, and you have the other one. I'm sorry.
Forgone, I guess, but
it's foregone and superfluous.
Yeah.
There's also circumnavigatory innovations, and so these are adaptations to restrictions, and they're adaptations that don't create. There's not like the tent bubble, that we see in outdoor dining now. Not like that, but maybe adaptations around a restriction entirely, and that adaptation becomes more resistant to regulatory intervention in the future by virtue of it being adapted to an intervention in the first place. And so I didn't see much about the circumnavigatory adaptations. These actually may make a system more resistant to intervention and regulation overall. And so that seems like a kind of a different feedback process. I don't know. I can take it offline and discuss a little bit more with you that later, and I have notes that I can send you to about that.
Yeah,
thanks.
I thank you, Abby. That's great. I mean, you gave me lots to think about. I definitely need to acknowledge what you said about the inability to explore all alternatives, right? Like that's not possible. So, and there's time of computation and tinkering, for sure. As for what happens when we adapt to restrictions, does that make the system more resistant? I don't know. That's something to think about. So I guess I don't have an answer right now, but I would love to continue talking. So thanks, and definitely send me your notes if that's convenient. But thanks. Yeah, awesome. Okay, on my I have John next. And okay.
Yeah, thanks again for the talk. It was really good to hear the talk again after hearing it this past weekend. But I wanted to look at your paper before I asked a question. And this question is kind of more of a comment, and it's kind of also taking what Abby just asked and said, and also what was also before from Nathaniel. So it seems to me like your position about innovation is a bit closer to Shackle's position and not so much Kerzner, because Kerzner is really that middle point between the neoclassical and then Shackle. So I was just kind of curious, more so why you had used Kerzner and hadn't looked maybe at the whole critique from Buchanan and Vanberg, I think 1991, and looking at the whole Shacklean position.
Okay, so that's a good question. Very cool. So you will notice that this is I take one aspect from Kerzner, right? Like I don't really take his entrepreneurial discovery, right? I don't think it's relevant. I think I guess I've been thinking about Forgone Innovation before. So why did I use Kirsten, right? Like I've been thinking about this issue before I came across the essay. He seemed like someone who already thought about it too, seemed necessary to cite, right? And then as I read him, I think he makes a lot of good observations that are not necessarily reliant on his, trying to fit the whole opportunity concept into the equilibrium thinking. So I guess that's my response to that. As for Shackle, I think I have a reference in the paper at some point on the role of imagination. I think that's very, very important. I probably should spend more time thinking about that. Yeah, good point. Yeah, thank you. Right, Michaela?
Well, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation, and it seems like an extremely interesting application of the Entangled Political Economy framework. I think very similarly along the lines of John's question, just listening through made me openly wonder about whether your sort of final work might seek to engage other models, other frameworks of innovation, certainly thinking about von Hippel, his ideas about sort of user innovation. You can kind of link that in turn to Elinor Ostrom's framework of co-production, right? So innovation and co-production. Then it makes you think about whether regulation qua innovating for others, right? If I can put it in that sense, sort of, to what extent that kind of activity on the part of policymakers closes off along various margins. These sorts of, user sort of enabled innovations. And I should actually just say, of course, that the fact that all of the things that you listed, in terms of what might be potentially sort of foregone or actually existing in the real world, I think is an illustration and a testament of what Abby is talking about in terms of a circumnavigatory kind of innovation. People will sort of tinker and find ways, to work around sort of an regulation as innovating for others. There are also lots of interesting examples you can also touch on. I think blockchain as a circumnavigatory innovation might be another really, really interesting sort of application of your framework, because certainly policymakers are sort of active in the space to try to to emulate, right, some of the principles of certain blockchain applications like cryptocurrencies and other societies. In other senses, they're trying to sort of governments are trying to sort of limit use, right, to sort of try to constrain that sort of the use innovation potentials of that technology. So just a final thing for me, your paper also started me thinking about, does your work have any implications with respect to what kinds of regulatory form might be preferred along some margins and others? It seems to me that a principle-based regulation that's sort of like more abstract, and then allowing people to sort of tinker along sort of wider sets of margins, might be preferred under your framework than a highly prescriptive one. Then you got other examples like IP, for example, as connoting very highly prescriptive forms of regulation and sort of principles based. So there were just a bunch of comments. If you have reactions, great. If not, yeah, let's push on.
Thank you, Michaela. No, those are a great observation. Haven't thought of blockchain, but you're right. That is sort of like a response to a regulatory environment, and that makes it challenging to think of what would be instead, right? If we are starting with regulation as this point to which innovation responds. So that's definitely something to think about. As for the regulatory environment, so obviously it's entangled political economy, so there is no world without politics, right? There's always that there, and I guess maybe that's also something that we need to think more like yes, principle based than degeneracy, right? So allowing for discovery in policy, right? As less of a federal or top-down approach. Yeah, I don't know. Let me, yeah, more to think. I don't know if I can respond to that from the top of my head right now, but thank you for the suggestion. Yeah. Okay. All right. I have Ginny and Jamie. Ginny, I don't know.
Thank you so much for a really awesome talk. I'm so sorry about the ambient music. I'm not usually in my usual space, so please do bear with me as I try to get through what I want to say. I thank you so much for your presentation. It was really awesome. And I inherently agree with you that regulations can stifle human creativity and dynamic nature of the market. And I think that's a really important point to emphasize at the top of our lungs. As you were speaking, and also Michaela touched on this, it really made me sort of think of Elinor Ostrom's work and also Tocqueville's work. One of the things that he said, and that Tocqueville said was, for instance, having government step in to solve certain types of problems, collective action problems, is probably not ideal. Not only because of the things that are more apparent, but also because people lose the creativity or the habit of solving collective action problems. So there is that sort of, we lose the habit of being creative, if you will. So your paper really, for me, really sort of touched on that. The one comment that I had was, and let me just preface it by saying it may be in your paper, and I really do apologize if it is in your paper. Coming out of your talk, as it currently stands, it's not apparently clear to me whether you intend this to be a primarily sort of theoretical or theory grounded work, or whether you intend it to be sort of more illustrative for to engage like mainstreamers, for instance, to say, hey, there's some things that we don't talk about in mainstream, and these are the reasons why it's really important for us to talk about. And the coming out of the talk, it's like it felt like your argument needed one of those two things, like either more theory to make it to sort of push home the argument. Here's the reason why we need to think about regulation in this manner, or present more detailed cases or examples for mainstreamers to sort of better hook their hands onto it, to be like, oh, I now see why we need to think of it more deeply in this direction. And I was wondering whether, first of all, just wanted to ask what you hope for the paper in the future, to in what direction you're planning on going with the paper, and then and just speak a little bit more on that. Thanks.
Okay. So that's okay. So I don't know if I have the answer to that either. So whether it's more empirical or more theory, I definitely think that the empirical paper part, as it is in the paper, needs more work. It's just a sketch for now. So definitely that needs to be elaborated. Of course, I would love to engage the mainstream and have them just like give up all those mainstream modeling techniques, right? Is this going to be accomplished with this paper? Hopefully, unlikely. But I think it's still worthwhile, right? Even if it's on a tiny margin, to bring those up. And in many ways, this is actually an exercise for myself, because I want to find a way to communicate that other costs of regulation effectively, even though, as I argued, right, we don't know. And what I talk about in the paper, you know, one conclusion could be, let's encourage economists and other social scientists to think of what those innovations could be. I mean, there are some papers, right, suggesting like regulatory solutions or market design literature, but usually those are going to be falling short of what could be generated through the innovative process, right? So like what we can imagine is less than what we what innovation can bring about. I like what you mentioned about the creative habits. I think that's also worth talking about and thinking about, right? So with COVID, the initial bottom-up response was very creative, right? I mean, here nearby, there is one restaurant that had to let go of all its workers, so they packed up all the frozen food and sent it home, and then they figured out some ways to support the people that were let go in the first couple of weeks. All of that was erased, right? Once you started getting the checks from the government. So so sort of like how top-down solutions kill those creative habits, and that sort of like even believe, right, that we can solve our own problems. I think that's something worth thinking about. Okay, I've Jamie and I think Jim you mentioned too, so I'll go to Jamie and then Jim.
Thank you for the talk, Marta. It was awesome. Your thought experiment about the internet got me thinking about other areas where that's the case, where there's one kind of little thing that leads to a big chain. And I see, I'm not suggesting you use this as an example because it's so different from your area, but I see this in some of the discourse about whether or not women should have rights that was taking place in especially the 18th and 19th century, because it was this conversation like, what would women even do with those rights? What would they do outside the home? What would be the purpose of having them in a university? It's just this failure to be able to imagine.
Yeah.
And so Bastiat's insight has this kind of problem too, where it encourages us to kind of think harder, but it still requires us to imagine, especially if you're using it as an input into a kind of cost benefit analysis, which I think people like to do. So you can like think of, I don't know, think about some of my colleagues who work on policy in a way where they're like presenting reports to the Hill, like from the other side of Mercatus. Like they're trying to come up with a better cost benefit analysis, but they're still trying to imagine themselves what might be the benefits and the costs of, you know, enacting or not enacting this particular regulation. So I could imagine an argument like yours about, oh, but like we can't possibly imagine what could be innovated if we allowed this to happen, being used in the service of an analytical process like that.
Okay.
But then of course, what people, you know, you can reasonably reply to that with, but okay, but if we're supposed to be humble and we can't know and we can't imagine the future, how can we be so sure that these things you're telling us we're missing out on are going to be so great or going to be worthwhile? And especially because we're asking people to give up some kind of tangible benefit today for an invisible, an invisible alternative that they can't imagine and don't know what it will look like in the future. So in a way, I could also see your argument being used in the service of rejecting cost benefit analysis entirely. So I'm curious what you think about that. Does your argument improve our cost benefit analyses, or does it suggest that we should not be conducting them at all? Which, I mean, asks a really hard question about what the alternative is. But I think this is the last thing I'll say, but I think you're really getting at something at the heart of liberalism here, because somebody who has liberal predispositions hears your argument and says, of course, this is why we need freedom, because we need this maximum opportunity for experimentation and learning. And it's the only way of living that's consistent with this human drive to be better and to improve. But then the conservative hears that and says, oh, your argument is right. And that's exactly why we need that regulation, because something's going to change and we don't know what that's going to be. So we better not do it.
Right.
So, I mean, I think you're really kind of getting at the heart of something really important here, I think.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. That's interesting, right? With cost and benefit analysis. So can we think of a specific policy, maybe, I don't know, minimum wage, or maybe something a little more challenging. Let's see, minimum wage, right? I guess I wouldn't necessarily speak directly to the cost benefit analysis as much as to think of what kinds of processes or would be prevented by that regulation, right? Like what is, so what I take away from Koppel and Kaufman and that group of researchers is that this tinkering process is unstoppable, and it's always ongoing, right? And they have a paper with Abby with this like explaining the hockey stick, right? That and they even make this argument that at some point the regulation stops to matter, right? Because the innovative process is sort of I don't know, like independent of institutions, right? Like in the very long run. But I think that for the purpose of like making this argument in defense of not having minimum wage or not implementing the particular regulation, that's back to the discovery and the learning, right? Like what sorts of transactions are not going to happen because you have just put in place this particular regulation. Okay, and I don't know if that's answered your question, but I would need to think a little harder in response to that, like cost benefit as a way of evaluating policy, right? Okay, right. Okay, and I think Jim, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Thank you, Marta. So challenging questions, I think, that are being asked right now. So part of the problem that we're facing when we're thinking about these, whether we're talking about the welfare effects or just the impacts of innovation, what path you end up on, is the nature of searching the space, right? And so I immediately thought of Kaufman and Levin on the searching static landscapes. Mm-hmm. And so the idea there is that you have some pre-stated landscape that you're searching, and every time you find an evolutionary improvement in the landscape, it's going to take even longer to find the next one, right? And so what they find is that welfare improvements move linearly across log time. Okay, that's one way of stating that, or how they state that. Now the problem is that the landscape's actually dynamic. Right, and so, well, let's stick with the comparison here. What the market seems to do is allow for the broadest search of possibilities, the broadest search for things that could actually, say, improve our welfare or improve the state of technology and so forth. But there's two sides of this. One is if you bring in the state, you bring in some sort of intervention or regulation, it's going to skew where you're looking, but you have the simultaneous problem, and this was mentioned earlier, I think by Jeannie, or at least it was hinted at, that there's collective action problems that the market may or may not be able to solve, okay? And so what does the bias of the market look like in the search of the space versus what does the bias of the state look like in the search of the space? And I think that at least the starting point of thinking about a static landscape is helpful for thinking, okay, we're going to search a particular part of that, because it is the Kaufman and Levin model in computer science. When we're talking about binary search, right? You search half. You have a list of possibilities. You search half the list. If the answer is not in one half of the list, you start splitting the other half into halves, and you keep searching through that, right? This is sort of like the fundamental idea. Ultimately, you're searching randomly through the list, and you're going to eventually find it. Okay. Is the market really truly randomly searching or searching across the space in a manner that's random? Okay, I think I've said the problem well enough, but that space that you're actually looking at is a challenge to represent and to consider when you're developing that.
Your dog seems to vigorously agree with you, Jim.
Okay, all right, sorry, so you're saying that the dynamic, so is it a problem for both the market and the regulators, or is it more of a problem for one than for the other?
I don't know. I think you have to be agnostic in the approach, right? But that we know that there's going to be a bias in the market, the types of solutions the market generates. There's going to be a bias in the type of solutions that the state generates, and you know, identifying the collective action problems that one can solve versus the other, I think would be useful in understanding the different types of developments you're going to get.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, I think that's a very good way of thinking about it, and that the static versus dynamic landscape, yeah, I think that's useful. Of course, my bias, and this is just from the top of my head, so I'm not gonna like go to war on this, but I think that who is doing the searching matters, right? And how is the search being done? So in the market, we're all searching, right? Like in that realm of like liberty, or just when the solutions are offered in a competitive way, right? And I think that's also something that I tried to get into the paper, is that when you search with the market means, or like you innovate, you don't suppress anyone else from searching, right? So you can, maybe you will lose, but you don't actively do anything about anyone else not looking, right? Versus the regulatory solutions suppress everyone else, right? And I think that's the mechanism of the search that matters here. I don't know if I'm answering.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's a clear solution or anything like that, and that's I think important to consider, right, when you're thinking about the collective action solution, so to speak, or the state solution, of course, yeah.
Okay, and Nathaniel, your hand has been up for a while. Is this from the before, or do you have something new to? Do you want to jump in?
This is from before, but I have a quick thought just related to what you're just saying there, and that the conversation is what we actually want as human beings. So whether we get to the innovation or not, by blocking the opportunity to tinker and innovate, we may actually be blocking conversations that develop sympathetic exchanges. So this is going like outside of even what you've talked about, right? Whether we get better innovations, but if we don't have good conversations, that's an even bigger problem.
All right, I'm gonna be watching this video again. Like I find myself, it's very hard for me to think on the spot. I don't know if it's the maternity leave or it's been always like this, but I will watch this and think about it. Okay, Roger.
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, well, I mean, these are hard issues, so no kidding. Jim, I wanted to just pick up on what Jim was saying. Well, let me lower my hand, sorry. Was that I don't think I know this Kaufman and Levine model. Is that an NK model? Is that you know, Stu Kaufman? Yeah. There was a paper that maybe, Marta, you missed in the sort of stream that you're picking up on before the Koppel-Italy 2015, which was Phelan et al. 2014 in the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal.
Yeah.
And there we explicitly say, yeah, well, and there we explicitly say, like, you know, NK is groovy, sure, but you know, when you get to human action, it's kind of not as groovy, you know. So we kind of explicitly step away from NK models in that paper. In terms of, like, you know, bias of the market versus bias of the state, I mean, I think you said this in your answer, didn't you? With you know, quote unquote market search entanglement, but you know, with quote unquote market search, everybody at every sort of node in the division of labor is searching, is alert to opportunities. But you get a profound bandwidth constriction when you have the state. So that's just a really quite a radical qualitative difference between centralized search agency and then, you know, the great non-directed search of a decentralized process. There's plenty more to say, but I think that's all I'm going to say just now.
Yeah, no, Jim, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, but the brief comment, yeah, so I think Roger's right, and I think they're right. to understand. So this, if the space is dynamic, NK search breaks down, but I think the baseline might still be useful because it's the same thing, but now you're saying it's just like the combinatorial explosion of the state space. This is how I understand it. Maybe I'm incorrect, but I definitely think 2014, the couple mentioned, is important in that respect.
Yeah, nobody's saying burn the NK models. So if I even allow that to be like a subtext of my comments, please allow me now to withdraw any such subtext. Yeah, no, there's still, it's a tool and it can be great, but you know.
All right. Do we have any? Oh, Lenore, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Marta. This is quite interesting. I think a lot of the trend of the questions reflect a question that I had, and it may just be that we don't have a literature yet, or I don't know where the relevant literature is. But my question, as you were talking through this, because you were modeling, if we don't get this product, we don't get these products. And I'm wondering if there is a literature that really differentiates products and services, or as more of these comments we're talking about actual problem solving mechanisms, business models, and or habits. I mean, these are very different kinds of things. And I don't know, is there just a missing literature there? And Jenny's question made me think about this with the Tocquevillian point. I mean, Tocqueville's point is that the intervention can cause the innervation of the loss of habits, you know, so you're not conserving habits in that Hayekian sense of things we remember, we don't have to think about how to do. We have those habits of the heart, or we have these scripts and heuristics that we're using in terms of the deeper social norms. So I think there's something very fascinating to push along not just in terms of the sort of commercial products, but maybe services and, you know, deeply in the social norms question, which I think is what's tying back to Nathan's, you know, point about, you know, sympathetic conversations. You'll have to get his conference paper from Public Choice this weekend. So I'll do a pitch for him because we had a very nice panel on this topic, but on some related topics. But I think that's one particular place. And so I could think of an example in that regard, which would be what do food regulations by the local county health department have to do with driving out potluck dinners, and therefore, you know, the loss of these associations and sympathetic conversations that we can't predict what the loss of that is. The loss of it is, you know, citizens don't know one another and therefore don't come together to solve problems later. So I think what you're working on is very interesting in that regard, because I think it can push us to actually understanding the innovation processes as well as the Forgone Innovation. So there's Forgone community there. That's one sort of comment I had in question, just about, is there literature there? Secondly, I was curious when you were talking about the concept of tinkering. And, you know, these days, I wondered how we talk about the concept of tinkering in relation to this emergence of huge data analysis. I mean, we really seem to think in some perspectives that if we can just, you know, massage the data will tell us what to do. I think this relates to Roger's work, you know, deeply in terms of, you know, expert failure and such, but it's often not just expert opinion or the expert's knowledge that's limited. It's actually that we're putting a lot of confidence in just algorithms and data. So I think data don't tinker, right? They have to be programmed. And I guess unless we get to AI, tinkering AI, we're in an interesting space. But that was another just interesting frontier, I think, that this paper suggested to me. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lenore. Great. So a couple of things I actually want to respond to. So as for the literature, I think one book you might want to look up is Bain-Hawker's, I don't remember the title, but it's 2006, Bain-Hawker, and he talks about this like number of products and how we went from like 300 products in a small tribe to I don't know, Amazon now has 800,000 products or something, like an enormous number, right? And that might seem like such a focus on consumption and like the material world, but those products are solutions, right? In the end, and I mean, my microwave makes my life so much better and all that, right? So they are proxies for well-being. And I think when we talk about habits, I hope to one day spend some time thinking about how free liberalism or free market can at the same time encompass like consumption and materialism and like this like pursuit of having more, and minimalism, right? Like minimalism is a market trend, right? Like even though like the people within that movement seem to be rejecting consumerism, but minimalism is possible because of the free market. So I think that sort of speaks to those habits and how we can sort of search for that improvement, not necessarily just through the products, but through the solutions that come about as well. Anyway, Roger, you wanted to jump in, so I'll let you.
Just Brian Harker's book is Origin of Wealth. That's
Oh, the origins of wealth. Yes. And on the potluck dinners, I don't have that example in here or in the paper, but it's an excellent 2014. There was a company in Washington, D.C. that was doing sharing of home meals. So basically you could buy a spot at somebody's dinner table in their house. Super cool, like a restaurant in a house. And they disappeared because they basically were doing something illegal, right? But those regulations are so outdated. We have so many better ways of ensuring food safety that we don't have to have the requirements of commercial kitchens right now. So I mean that in itself is a great example. All right. So I think with that we shall close. Thank you all for joining me on the call and giving me so much to think about. I will watch this video a couple of times to pick up on all the suggestions. This was great. And next month we will hear from Abby Devereaux. So I'm looking forward to her presentation. I'll send you the paper in a while, in a couple of weeks probably. And in the meantime, I will have an email with some questions. So watch out for that. So thank you, and yeah, see you next month. Thank you so much. Thank you.